Okay, hello GCSE students and welcome to another fantastically interesting subject for this video in Mr. Gill's science stuff. This is on fossils, evolutions and extinction. It's in the GCSE biology topic on accepting Darwin's ideas, evidence for evolution and so on and so forth. Okay, this obviously is another wonderfully exciting, fascinating lesson that I really enjoy, and I really wish I could be teaching you this in person, but we have to make do. So what we're going to go through today literally is in the title. What are fossils? Why are they useful? How do they relate to evolution? And what is extinction and why is it important? So quite a bit of syllabus to get through today. The idea of the evidence for evolution, which includes fossils, antibiotic resistance in bacteria, and obviously the idea of things like genes being passed on to offspring and so on and so forth, and evidence in the fossil record, so on and so forth. What a fossil is and how they might form. Lots of early life forms being soft-bodied, the so-called Cambrian explosion. We'll get to that. What we can learn from fossils, why they're so important, and a bunch of other interesting evidence in terms of how we know evolution has taken place on the planet. We also have to mention that, of course, a vast majority of organisms that have ever lived are not with us anymore. They are extinct. Why extinctions occur and what the consequences are. And obviously these are our reasons as listed on the specification for our extinctions. Okay, so let's get stuck in. Now, obviously, I'm going to do a GCSE version of this for you as best I can, but one of the finest science communicators in terms of, on the subject of evolution in recent years is Richard Dawkins. Okay, and I highly recommend this book, The Greatest Show on Earth. He has a clarity in the way he writes that is absolutely the envy of everybody. He writes extremely well on subjects like evolution and genetics, as well as all his stuff on religion and God and so on and so forth. But for this topic, the evidence for evolution, and this is just a beautiful book, if you can get the one with the colour picture inserted as well. It's just a beautifully written, beautifully constructed book called The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. I would highly recommend it. It's a very good book for this topic. Okay, so we're going to go through the different categories, and we're going to spend more time on the first ones, fossils, and less time on antibiotic-resistant embryos and anatomical and DNA evidence, because of course fossils is a big chunk of your syllabus, antibiotic resistance is a slightly smaller one, and then embryos, anatomical and DNA very small or a bit extra. So we're only going to spend a very short amount of time on those. So the first thing to understand about fossils is the fossil record basically shows us like almost a time capsules of the past, going back through evolutionary history. So this diagram here, I keep meaning to learn this, but I don't know all of the eras by heart, but it's something I feel like I should have in my head, but I don't, is the geological eras. Now, you should know this, that sedimentary rock on sediment gets laid down, built up and up over time. Therefore, things that die at a certain layer over time end up deeper and deeper in the fossil record. So if you're digging back through these layers, things that are associated with a certain layer are associated with a certain time. Okay, and you can see some of the examples going back all the way down to the Paleozoic here and back to this layer called the Cambrian. Okay. And obviously we're up here now, and there's also a lot of talk now that you can actually see evidence of human intervention in the top layers, which makes maybe we're actually in a different era now. Maybe we're in the Anthropocene, the idea of human influence on the geology around us, things that could only have been manufactured by us. But that's obviously a modern debate. We're really more interested in what's gone on before so that we can have a look at geological history and evolution. Okay, so first things first, what is a fossil? Well, fossils are not the actual organism, and that's the first thing that gets first mistake that gets made on GCSE and A-level papers. Fossils are not the actual thing. Okay, they're the outlines. They're an impression, right? They're the outlines of the remains of plants or animals. The way they form, organisms die. They fall into a sort of a sediment or an area where they can't decompose. They don't rot. Okay, so they fall into sediment. They don't rot, or at least parts of them don't rot. And then, millions of years later, as layers build up on top of them of sediment, they get compressed. And the biological matter gets replaced with minerals, okay, so-called mineralization sort of process. As the biological matter disappears, what's left is like a cast or an imprint, okay, of the organism in the sediment. Okay, so I like this picture, which really illustrates that quite nicely. I think that on the left here, you've got the original fish here that's fallen into sort of sandy material. It's not decomposing well, and over the geological eras, you can see its biological tissue gradually gets replaced by minerals, and what's left is like a print or a plaster cast, okay, of all these different things. So I've got a few to show you, a few fossils to show you here. So for example, this little thing, that is a fossilized dinosaur tooth. It's obviously not the actual tooth. There's no enamel in there, right? There's no bone in there. That is purely rock, but that is a perfect imprint of what that dinosaur's tooth would have been like, okay? And you can see just how long that is. So that's a very long, and you wouldn't want to be bitten down on by a mouth full of those, okay? So that is made of rock, made of sedimentary rock, but it is a cast of a dinosaur's tooth, okay? And that's what a fossil is, okay? So why is it that they're useful? Okay, well, here's a really famous example that comes up on exams quite often, and in lots of books, textbooks, various things. It's the evolution of the horse, okay? Now the horse, 60 million years ago, used to be this kind of Labrador-sized, sort of flat-footed, forest-dwelling creature, okay? And that obviously then changed over time as the environment changed, as the environment got drier and more open, and they had to run around on plains. They got a lot more, got a lot taller, and they lost their toes, okay? And you can actually see this in the fossil record. As you go through the fossil record and get ancient ancestors of the horse, you can actually see the changes in the anatomy of their skeleton, of their feet, from what used to be sort of a toed wide foot, suitable for slightly damper ground, through to what we see now on a horse, which is a hoof, okay? So they show us how animals have changed over time. And once you get enough of these things, you can put together a very accurate family tree, okay? Very accurate historical family tree. So they give us really, really good lines of evidence for evolution and natural selection. For example, we know that things like ferns in the plant world are some of the most ancient plants around. They're very, very ancient plants. They predate sort of modern trees and the broadleafs and all that kind of stuff in terms of evolution. And the reason we know that is we can see them on our forest floors now, and also in the fossil record you find almost identical, right, lovely fossilized fern-like things, okay, that look almost like, exactly like the things that we've got today, okay? So they're very, very useful to show us what has changed and also what hasn't, okay? So I'll give you some other examples as well here. I mentioned this in a previous video. This is Archaeopteryx. It's probably one of the most famous fossils that there is. If you learn anything about fossils and evolution, Archaeopteryx comes up. And this is a specimen that found its way to the Natural History Museum in Darwin's time. It was run by a guy called Richard Owen at the time, who was the founder. He didn't believe that species could change over time. He basically fell out with Charles Darwin. Initially they were great friends. In fact, Richard Owen named a species of great ground mastodon after him, you know, a great ground sloth, Mastodon darwinii. But they fell out massively over this, the idea of evolution, the idea of species changing. And then this came into Richard Owen's collection, which is Archaeopteryx. And the reason why this is so important is this shows us one of the important branching points, okay? One of the important so-called missing links. Because one of the big arguments you get, if people don't like the idea of evolution, is they say, well, if fish and amphibians evolved from the same ancestor, where are the fishbians? Where are the, you know, amphibish? Where are the halfway house things? Where are the lizard birds? The lurds? The bizzards? Where are they? Surely if they all came from a common ancestor, where is that common ancestor? And the answer is, well, it's extinct, because it's not as good as a bird at being a bird and not as good as a lizard at being a lizard. So what we do find in the fossil record is you do find that there are things here, look, right, like Archaeopteryx, that have some features of a lizard, right? Some people just a reptile, so bony, so you've got a bony tail, you've got teeth in a jaw, not a beak, right? You've got claws on a finger here, but also then you've got feathers and primitive flight, like a bird, okay? So Archaeopteryx is an example. And there is actually a live descendant, living descendant of Archaeopteryx still alive in the tropical swamps of South America, called a Hutsin, right? Which basically still have claws. The juveniles still have claws, so they can climb away from caiman, right? And they stink. They've got a horrible digestive system as well. If you ever get near a Hutsin in the jungles of South America, they stink to high heaven. But anyway, so this also goes for us, right? We've got a very good, there are still gaps, obviously, but a very good understanding of human evolution, right, the broad brushstrokes thereof. This is a very famous human fossil. It's called Australopithecus afarensis. It's 3.3 million years old, and this fossil here was named Lucy. It's the first upright walking ape. Okay, the pelvic bones, the way they're positioned compared to the modern great apes, show that she walked upright, and she's the earliest link, or at least for a long time was the earliest link, and there may be slightly earlier ones now, to show upright walking in primates, i.e. in us, the first of the hominids, as it were, right? The first of the upright walkers. So Australopithecus afarensis, aka Lucy. The reason she got the name Lucy is that the paleontologists, while they were there with their brushes, digging her up in Ethiopia, were listening to the Beatles, and particularly Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So the story goes, okay? So she's one of the earliest links in the human record and shows us a nice progression through, right, to what we are now. Okay, so they're obviously incredibly useful. She was quite short, 4 foot tall, right? But they're incredibly useful in showing us our ancestry, the links between great groups, and the sort of history of life on our planet. And sometimes you get really, really lucky. Sometimes animals die in conditions where they can't decompose pretty much at all, right? Now this is really rare, and lucky for us, unlucky for the animal. But this species of dinosaur here, we know an awful lot about. Okay, the idea is its pigmentation, its organs, its skin texture, because this type of dinosaur here was very common in a certain era. It was basically the equivalent of like the herd animals, like a cow or a buffalo or something, that roamed around the plains. Very, very common, and partial fossils have been found of loads of these. But occasionally, as I say, you get very, very lucky. So in the Americas was found one of these that had actually died by falling into a tar pit. Now in a tar pit, nothing could decompose. So it wasn't just the hard bits that were left, because normally it's just bones and skeletons and shells and things that stay put. In very specific circumstances, you end up with whole dinosaur fossils like that. Okay, so this is obviously a gold mine of information, because not only could we see the skeleton, the soft tissues were fossilised, the organs were fossilised, even the stomach contents were fossilised. So through scanning techniques and imaging techniques, we could actually work out what this dinosaur's last meal was. A wealth of information. And if you've ever wondered what dinosaur skin looks like, it looks like that. Okay, that's part of its fossilised skin texture. And from looking at that under the microscope, you can actually found fossilised pigment cells, which by comparing to modern pigment cells, you can actually work out the coloration of the dinosaur. So incredible wealth of information and knowledge, right? Of course, there are those people who don't believe that the Earth is this old, okay, which it is. The Earth is billions of years old. There are some people who think that the Earth is a lot younger than that, and they've come up with some very interesting ways of explaining the age of the Earth and all these fossils, and why these fossils are where they are in the layers that they're in. Okay, and I'll show you one of those for a bit of fun in a moment, right? But we've got obviously here other things like fish, bears, mammoths, and that kind of stuff. So other fossils would include things like our elk here, right? Now, these two on this side aren't strictly speaking fossils, okay? They're basically, this one here is called a bog fossil, okay, which basically is a large elk that fell into a very acidic bog, and that preserved its body, okay, and preserved its bones, right? You can actually look up, if you look at bog fossils on Google, you'll find a lot of very preserved human bodies, so bog mummies, and I chose not to put the pictures of those in the presentation because they're fairly graphic. So, but if you are steely of stomach, then do go. You can go and look at those fascinating information about how humans have changed in the recent history. This is called an ice fossil. This is a baby woolly mammoth, and it's one of the individuals they're hoping to bring mammoths back via. Right, and this obviously was frozen in the permafrost in Siberia. So that's an ice fossil. Now these two are not strictly fossils because they are the living material. They are the bones and the soft tissues of the organism rather than a mineral version. Okay, so over here, look, we've got other fossilized things. So this is called a coprolite, which is fossilized dinosaur poo. Okay, so that's, I think, T-Rex poo. Right, so you can tell an awful lot about the diet of the organism from the fossilised poo. You've also got fossilised footsteps, fossilised footprints here, which, if you're very lucky, you can find fossilised footprints of dinosaurs and what lived around them, so you can get an idea of the whole ecosystem of what was following what was hunting what, and also how animals moved, so how dinosaurs and their predecessors moved around the world, and so locomotion. And of course the plants, so this is a fossilised tree we've got here. So as I was saying, right, there are those people who think that these came about by some other mechanism, right? That these ancient fossils here can't be any more than a few thousands of years old, when actually they are hundreds of millions of years old. And the way they explain that is quite interesting sometimes. So I'm going to just briefly show you this as one suggested explanation as to how the Earth can only be a few thousands of years old, have contained dinosaurs, and still have all those fossils. Okay, so this is literally Jesus riding a dinosaur, which of course we know never happened. Right, moving on. There is a big gap, however, and this was a big problem for many, many years in the fossil record. So go back to this picture here, look. So if we go back, we go to about 540 odd million years ago, about 500 million years ago, and we go back through some of the things you'd be familiar with, so the more the fish and the mammals and things like that, and then you come back to the Mesozoic area here, the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, the Triassic, where it's dinosaurs, and we all know what dinosaurs are like, and then you go to the Paleozoic back here, where you get much more simple creatures, and right the way back here to the Cambrian, where the fossil record seems to start very suddenly with things called trilobites and ammonites. Now, trilobites are sort of wood-licey things, and ammonites are these shells. Okay, so this is what you can find if you go fossil hunting, sort of on the south coast of the UK. They're pretty common, right? So these are ammonites. Okay, they're sort of descendants of things called nautilus, or things with the nautiluses. Yeah, they're shelled creatures, aquatic living, and then you've got these sort of wood-licey things, right? Called trilobites. Right, there's one there. I think this is obviously a cast, a replica, but these ones are and they're fairly common. You can find them pretty easily. Dorset coast is your best place to go for those. The Isle of Wight, that kind of stuff, because that's sort of sedimentary rock that's being eroded away nowadays. So the problem that's presented by this is that, well, if the fossil record kind of stops with these ones, and sometimes you get really big ones as well. Look, really big one there. Look. Right, so that's our quite a large ammonite. Right, if the fossil record just sort of starts with these, was what happened before? How did we just suddenly poof get these things? Right, and this phenomenon about half a billion years ago is called the Cambrian explosion. Right, the idea that suddenly there was bam, nothing, bam, then an explosion of all these fossil species in the fossil record. Okay, Cambrian there. This is, you know, obviously a bit of a mystery. Before 500 million years ago, very few fossils. Why was that? Well, the reason was that their bodies were actually too soft to fossilise, which I'm sure you could work out if you thought about it yourself. If you haven't got bones or a shell or anything hard, it's very, very unlikely that that anything about you is going to fossilise. Right? You're going to decay and move away. Right? So until the evolution of bones and shells, very few things fossilised. Now, there are Pre-Cambrian fossils. They do exist. They're just way harder to find. And at the time this conversation was going on, no one had found them, really. And it wasn't sort of until the 1900s, so 1950s particularly, when Pre-Cambrian fossils started to be discovered more commonly and recognised for what they were. Okay? So that is part of your spec. Why do we not get them until one particular layer? And the reason is the bodies are too soft to fossilise. Now, if you want to know about the best conditions to fossilise stuff, I recommend another book to you. It's called How to Fossilise My Hamster by a New Scientist, which gives practical tips on how to make sure you and your beloved pets have the best possible chances of fossilising for future geologists. Okay, How to Fossilise Your Hamster by a New Scientist. Right, so Pre-Cambrian fossils do exist, and this is an example from really close to home. This, you might recognise actually, this place. This is Charnwood Forest, sort of between Loughborough and Leicester. Okay, so just up the M69 from where we are at the moment. Okay, so that obviously is pretty. I might have been walking there. We've done D of E or something like that. And these rocks are actually unbelievably ancient. Okay, and therefore fossil hunters thought for ages, well, they're billions of years old, there's no point looking for any fossils in there. But it was actually a schoolboy in the 1950s who found this fossil here, right, which is called Charnia, named after the Charnwood Forest. And it's basically a sort of ancient version of what's called a sea fan, which if you've ever been probably see these things that wave through the water and harvest nutrients out of the water. We reckon it looked like that. And you can go and see this fossil in Leicester Museum, okay? So it's called Charnia, right? And actually that is a Pre-Cambrian fossil. So it just got very, very lucky to fossilise. And around the world you do see impressions, so for example in Australia, of fossilised jellyfish from Pre-Cambrian things. So the traces of life do exist, they're just way harder to find before you've got a shell to rely on. Okay? And I just dropped my trilobite. Oh well. Right. So, why can't we see all these things now? Well, obviously they've gone extinct. So, you have to know a list of reasons why things would go extinct. So, the dodo is a most famous example. We even say dead as a dodo. Why did the dodo go extinct? Well, one of our reasons for extinction is a new predator, i.e. us. We turned up. Now, dodos weren't good to eat, but their eggs were. So, people came into their environments, they would shoot the nest defenders to get at their eggs, which were very tasty, and that wiped them out very, very quickly. There are many other examples around the world where humans have wiped out species. You can have a look at this picture. What do you think we're going for here? That, of course, is a black rat, and you probably know them as carriers of fleas, which carry diseases, so new diseases. The introduction of new diseases has the ability to render species extinct if they cannot adapt and evolve to match it. Okay. Here we've got another picture. What do you think we're looking at here? So we've got some African dogs, some hyenas and some lions. Okay, we're looking at competition. So a new competitor gets introduced into an environment which basically fills the same ecological niche as another existing animal, and obviously one animal's got to adapt or it's going to go extinct. That one, very prescient at the moment, and the subject of a whole other module, a whole other playlist that we're going to do, right, is of course environmental change, climate change. The environment is constantly changing. A lot of the huge ice age animals, your woolly mammoths, your woolly rhinos, all those kind of things went extinct at the end of the last ice age because the environment was no longer suitable for them. Okay, this one, of course, most famous reason for extinction, the one that's most widely touted as the reason that dinosaurs went extinct, a major catastrophe like a meteorite. So you're supposed to be able to, if you're asked, pull up 2 or 3 of these examples: a new predator, new disease, competition, environmental change, and major global catastrophes. And if you want to jot those down and make any notes, then feel free to pause and do so. But they are the ones you should be using. Okay, moving on. All right, nice study tip here for you. If you are asked a question on why an animal goes extinct, it's usually a good idea to talk about something changing. If you just say the environment, well, what about the environment? It's about the environment changing. That's the point. Okay, right. That is our largest chunk of this lesson done, fossils, because it's the largest chunk of your syllabus. We're now going to increasingly rapidly mention these other 4, and we're going to go on to antibiotic resistance. You don't need to go back very far in history at all to watch evolution occurring. In humans, because our generation time, takes up to like 20, 30 years, maybe 40 years for a generation to go, our evolution is relatively slow, right? So in your lifetime, you might see, I don't know, 3 generations, 4 generations if you're lucky. that's not enough time to witness evolution taking place. But for things that reproduce more quickly, like bacteria, we can watch it happen in real time. And there's a fantastic video, I'll put a link in the description, showing the evolution of antibiotic resistance in a large agar plate here. So what we've got here, these stripes are basically strips of agar jelly with more and more and more bacteria, more and more antibiotic. And initially the bacteria can't grow in them, and then these dots represent where mutations take place, and then suddenly the bacteria can move into a higher antibiotic concentration, okay? And eventually, right, they move into this central area, which has got 1,000 times the antibiotic they were originally resistant to, okay? By adding antibiotics, we've changed their environment. It's an environmental pressure. They adapt or they die, right? They reproduce exceptionally quickly. They mutate exceptionally quickly. So we can watch this happening in real time. Evolution you can see, okay? So antibiotic resistance is a fantastic example of evolution in the modern world. So for example, MRSA, you've probably heard of, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is a normal skin bacteria, a version of a normal skin bacteria that if you've had surgery, for example, and gets in, time was, you just gave the patient post-operatively some antibiotics and jobs are good. Now, MRSA is resistant to most antibiotics that you can give, right? And that's happened really and become a major problem within your lifetime, okay? All of that and other things that you can actually watch evolving, all animal breeding. Now, it might not be nature doing the selecting, it might be us, but the process is the same. If you take animals with traits that you like and you breed them together, all domestic animals, dogs, cows, horses, cats, and breed them all together, you will get new varieties and new traits emerging. For example, racehorses, their hearts are so much larger than their wild ancestor because we've bred them to pump blood around their body and run faster and faster and faster, okay? And of course, this is taken directly from the Greatest Show on Earth book I mentioned earlier. Cool little experiments with guppies, which are little fish, where it's an advantage if you're a male guppy to be brightly coloured because the females will like that, but it's a disadvantage because you're more likely to get eaten. So if you put guppies in an environment without any predators, then the males, literally over 2 to 3 generations of sexual selection, natural selection, become very brightly coloured. And then if you put a predator in that environment, within 2 to 3 generations, they go back again, okay? And it's that effective selective pressure that drives evolution. And we can watch this taking place. And there are loads of other examples, but do have a look at the Greatest Show on Earth if you want to know more of those examples. So that's all we're going to say on antibiotic resistance. It's evolution you can watch happening in real time. Here are some other forms of evidence for you as well. Embryology. The range of creatures who start their life the same is evidence that we all come from a common origin. For example, that fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit and us, all of us, right, at the early stages of development look the same. We have a tail, right, we have gills in the womb, right, all sorts of different things, okay, that make us basically the same. And it's only later in our development that we start to become more distinct. So there's embryological evidence, right, that we are very similar, okay? There's also anatomical evidence, both positive and negative. So the idea that if you've got an effective map, an effective pattern, this is the cat family, the feline family, or Felidae, right? They basically are going to keep some of those features, but fiddle with other ones. So all sorts of cats of different sizes, different colours, different pigmentations, different size of teeth, but the basic plan is the same. So like a lion and a tiger are essentially the same cat in a different coat, right? You've also got anatomical evidence that's not so good, that shows accidents of historical legacy. For example, the fact that all the light sensitive cells in your eyes point into the back of your skull. The nerves come out in front of them and then punch a hole in your retina to get to your brain. So that's why you've got a blind spot in your eyes. That the designer or anything, you know, if you could go backwards and go, hang on, that's stupid, and fix it, would never have come up with that, right? That is an accident that just is good enough, so it carries on, and that's evolution. And so one really good example of the one of these evolutionary mistakes, one of these historical errors, is the recurrent laryngeal nerve. So the recurrent laryngeal nerve is basically the nerve I'm using to talk to you right now. So it's the one that goes, you know, from my brain down to my larynx and makes my larynx move. And it doesn't need to go any further than, say, 20 centimetres, but it actually goes all the way down, round the great arteries of my heart and back up to innervate my larynx. Okay, it doesn't need to do that, and that's not just me, that's you as well. I'm not just wired weird, but it does that because throughout history, right, necks have got longer and longer and longer. In an ancient fish ancestors, there really wasn't a neck to worry about. So every iterative change, right, is easier than actually going back to the drawing board and rewiring. And this even happens in organisms with a neck as long as the giraffe. Okay, so as the giraffe's neck elongated, there was no point where it was able to go, hang on a minute, my laryngeal nerve goes right round my heart. That's not how evolution works. If it works well enough, it carries on, it gets by, and it passes those genes down. Okay, so as you can see here, we've got only needs to go about 20 centimeters in the giraffe as well, but it goes all the way down that long neck and all the way back up. And there is a fantastic dissection video, if you want to watch this nerve being dissected out, that I've put a link to in the description. Okay, so that brings us to the end, which brings us to the last and most concrete form of evidence, which is the genetic code. We've already discussed this in another playlist, but it's the fact that genetic code is the same across all animals and all organisms, bacteria, humans, plants, doesn't matter, the code works the same, is proof that we are all related. Right? And when you compare those genes, you can see just how closely related we are, that you're 99.8% related to all other humans, about 98%, 95 to 98%, depending on how you count it, related to chimpanzees, and about 50% genetically related to a cabbage. Okay, so quite a long way different on the tree of life there. And this understanding has allowed us to move bits of DNA around from one organism to another and end up with wonderful things like this, okay, glow-in-the-dark mice, obviously quite a dramatic example of genetic engineering, but there are lots of other good things we can do with genetic engineering now we have this understanding. So there you have it. That's all our evidence for evolution. We've got fossils, antibiotic resistance, embryos, anatomical evidence, DNA evidence, and I do highly, highly recommend you have a little read of The Greatest Show on Earth. I hope that's been informative. Sorry for the edit, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.